Good afternoon and welcome to Catapult Lockdown Virtual Salon Series. My name is Natalie Urquhart. I'm a curator and museum director at the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands. And this afternoon, I'll be in discussion with Susan Maines, a visual artist and gallerist from Grenada. Before we begin, I'd like to express our sincere thanks to the Catapult team for making this series of salons happen. The American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk. Please feel free to ask your questions in the comments section of the talk, and we'll get to those at the end of our discussion in the Q&A segment of the salon. And of course, subscribe to the Fresh Milk YouTube channel. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce self-taught artist Susan Maines, a Grenadian who grew up on the island and is 4 generations of Grenadians on the island since 1950. For more than 30 years, Susan Maines has been pursuing the mystery of the Caribbean in her painting, writing, and now mixed media works. Her work has been exhibited in the Caribbean, Canada, the USA, Germany, Australia, and China, and is collected internationally. I'll also be talking to Susan about her work as a gallerist. She first opened her own gallery in 2002, Art and Soul in Spiceland Mall, and recently opened a second space with her son Asher Maines, also a visual artist, called Art House 473 in the village of Caliste in Grenada. Susan was recently awarded, very prestigiously, a member of the British Empire Award for her long-standing service to the visual arts. Susan, it's a real pleasure to welcome you today.
Hi, so thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here with you and to be able to speak to the other artists of the Caribbean. Really happy.
It's been a wonderful series. You know, it's one thing to follow. You know, we're aware of a lot of the other people that have been participating in the salons, but to hear from artists, curators, storytellers, musicians directly, particularly in this moment, I think has been incredibly uplifting.
It has been.
It really has. And I think hopefully the start of many future collaborations and projects throughout. So it's been great. And I'm just loving your background today because I'm thinking, wow, mine's looking a little bit dull. This is my museum director background I've got on. You've got your visual artist.
I wanted to do this in my studio, but then I decided it was just too messy to show. So just a little painting on a wall.
It's perfect. I'm cheating because on the other side of my desk, I have a lot of the books and the mess, but this is the neat side. But it was great to briefly chat with you last week as well and kind of prep up this session. But I'm really interested to kick off today because your journey in a way has been like many of us in the region. We might be drawn to wanting to pursue a career in the arts, but often told as young people that we need to go and find a more sensible job and end up finding ourselves at university studying everything but the creative sector. And I work a lot with young people in the Cayman Islands to try and kind of sort of use examples of people like myself in what we call, you know, proper, real jobs in the creative sector. I mean, it can happen in our countries, and use these examples to showcase to parents that more and more young people be supported in these creative careers. So I'd love to start today by hearing about your own journey. You know, you went in a sensible direction and then came back to the real world of the arts.
Yes.
And tell us about that.
I had always loved art from the time I was a child. All through my teenage years, I painted little amateur stories about life in Grenada. And when it was time to go to university, I told my parents I want to go to art school. And they said, don't be silly. And so I went off to university in the States. I did a first degree in sciences, and then I went on to pursue education. I have a master's and a doctorate in education. But it was while I was living in Dominica for a few years. You know, we had a little revolution in Grenada, and my husband and myself ran away for a bit. And we lived in Dominica, and it was while I was there, I was doing my little amateur paintings at home, and a young Dominican artist, a teenager at the time, he came home and he says, you know, you could do much better than this. And, you know, some people would have been put off by that and taken it as an insult, but I took it as a challenge, and I said, show me how. And he started criticizing my work. So when I say I'm a self-taught artist, it means I didn't go to university or art school, but I have been taught. I've been taught by other artists, by traveling and going to museums when I can. And now by seeing so much available on the internet that you can really scan the world of art. So, and then, you know, as far as the rest of it goes, moved back to Grenada in 1992. At that time, there were a couple of galleries, Yellow Puig Gallery and Art Grenada. Over the years, I just found, even though I was selling well, because my commercial work has an appeal to visitors, and visitors were one of my primary market sources, I wanted more than that. I wanted a contemporary expression. And so that sort of motivated me to start my own gallery and use it as a platform for mentoring young artists.
And I think that's, you know, just the longevity of your space speaks so much to, I would say, the diversity of what you're doing. I know in my own country, and Cayman is probably one of the smallest islands in the whole of the Caribbean. You know, contemporary galleries have struggled. The ones that have remained the more tourism-driven type galleries, and I think your focus is probably broad enough to manage both sides of that. But I think, you know, we all know the energy that needs to go into keeping these kind of spaces propped up when the art ecology or the community is much smaller.
Yeah, and I have to say, for the contemporary side, we don't get any grants. We don't get any support from government or anywhere outside. You know, this is amazing what Catapult has done, because, you know, in painting for 30, 35 years, this is the first time I have received a grant to be able to do something. So it's really amazing.
That's fantastic. And you know, I think, as you say, what Catapult's doing in a journey of other art happenings, like Tilting Axis has been going strong for a few years, has some of the same partners like Fresh Milk. And it's just opening up the possibilities, I think, of these networks and exchanges and collaborations. Right. But none of that functions, as you say, well, it functions, but with a lot of sweat and tears. And to have the addition of being recognized formally with a grant, I think is one of the remarkable aspects of Catapult, and so necessary in this moment when artists are struggling across the world and across the Caribbean as well. And we'll get later on in the presentation, I want to talk about obviously lockdown and moving forward and what that looks like in terms of different ways of engaging and how you guys have been innovating. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, let's talk about your artistic practice, so we don't miss that part. I'm very, very excited to hear more about that. Before we move into what you've been doing recently, tell me a little bit about your own focus over the years in your practice. Well, I've just read one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading through your bio, and you describe your work as an exploration of gender, culture, and relationships of the Caribbean within the Caribbean. And I noticed that a lot of your work is landscape-based, so you really explore that very much in a sense of space. So yeah, tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people look at my work that is the more commercial work, meaning that it sells easier, and they say, oh, it's just pretty pictures. But if they're just seeing pretty pictures, it means they don't know quite enough yet. And part of it is an education process. I talk about the way I paint. I paint in layers, and just like I paint in layers, our culture is very layered. You hear one side of a story and you think that's the truth. Then you hear the other side of the story and you say, oh, that must be the truth. Then you heard a third side of the same story. And somewhere in the midst is that intangible truth that only reveals itself if you're willing to sit down and listen and to watch and to spend some time with it. And a lot of my paintings, this is the way they are. It might look like a landscape, but there's cues and hints in it. One of my favorite views is the one from my home, looking across at Morongozo in St. Paul's. And before we had a hurricane in 2004, there were little wooden houses across that hillside. And the nutmeg trees had grown very tall, which means they weren't being cared for properly, because a nutmeg tree, in order for it to produce, has to be trimmed every year. And so a rounded nutmeg tree is a productive nutmeg tree. So when you see my paintings with the little houses and these huge, towering, tall nutmeg trees, an insider would know somebody's not taking care of the essentials. So, they're full of hints, full of stories,
Right.
full of
Commentary.
things that tell you about us.
And I think, one of the things that we struggle with sometimes in our museum sector here, when we're talking about using art as an educational prop or tool, is just how powerful those kind of stories can be in this visual sense.
Yes.
And a lot of what we're doing at the museum in our space is sort of reminding schools that, you can use these props to tell that, to point out that someone isn't maintaining those trees, and how to maintain those trees and why it's so important.
And it starts the conversation.
Absolutely. And you do, I've read a lot about the educational work that you've been doing through your space as well. Tell me a little bit more about that then. So your practice as an artist leading into that, but of course the gallery as well.
Well, the new place that we have, Art House 473, we opened in 2018 after paying years of rent for a bigger space in Spiceland Mall. We sort of added it up and we go, we could have bought a building. And so we started looking around for a building to buy, and we found a disused church. It hadn't been used in over 10 years. And we were able to purchase it with a mortgage and have made that into an educational space. And so we have room for classrooms, for exhibit. In the future, we would like to do residencies. Our programming, of course, is on halt for now, but in the future, we do hope to be able to use that again for that education and that reach into the community and the international community.
So that's almost like having a hybrid model of the nonprofit education space and the commercial gallery. It's a really interesting model that is obviously working well, and something that we should maybe look further at across the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean, we cannot depend on grants. We have to do something to generate enough money for us to make it work ourselves. The grant makers aren't really looking at us. I looked at so many after COVID, and it said, for this country or that country, or this, ethnicity or that, and most of us in the Caribbean, we just don't qualify.
We certainly have that challenge in our space, because to add an even more complicated framework, obviously the Cayman Islands is still British territory, although sort of conceptually and certainly culturally is very independent from that. So it is a difficult system to navigate, and we've been trying to get past that by collaborating with different countries and different organizations, which works well. And I read as well, a very dear friend of mine, and I would say mentor in many ways, is Rosie Gordon-Wallace in Miami, and Diaspora Vibe, I think, have come down, and you've done exchanges and collaboration.
She has brought groups of artists to Grenada, and I think Grenada was the first place she came to on an international exchange. And then we have taken groups up to Miami to her space.
And how, because I do want to touch on some of the other international work you've done. You've been to the Venice Biennale. We're going to get to that. I want to use this platform as well for some advocacy to say those kind of I really believe myself are invaluable.
They are.
We have a thriving art scene in the Cayman Islands, but a lot of our artists haven't had the opportunity yet to go abroad or exhibit abroad. And Miami's, relatively close. I think one of the things that have been quite profound for some of our younger artists, we've supported a couple on the Caribbean linked residency exchange that Fresh Milk and Atelier 89 in Aruba have been doing. And they come back, and just having access to other conversations and dialogues is life-changing in many ways.
It is. And we have to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves.
And how have you put that together from your space through the gallery? the sort of collaborations? Is that something, again, you've sought private funding for?
Yeah, and private funding is sometimes me in my pocket from my sales of my paintings.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, big respect for that, and thank you for it. We need more pioneers like yourself doing that kind of work. We'll talk near the end about the sort of international work, because I think that fits really well into how we are evolving in this moment as well, both online and in the future in person. But I'd love to move into really looking at this project that we touched on in our earlier discussions, because I'm really fascinated about this body of work that was created in advance or at the beginning of lockdown, correct me, but that has really taken on a life of its own in the lockdown moments, and really come to reflect this life-changing time that we're all living in. And I think we actually have some video for this as well, don't we? So if we could get the first video up.
Yeah, so this series of work are large. They're 9 feet by 12 feet, and they're done on raw canvas. This first one was actually the first one that was created for the series. I had planned to do a show in May at Art House, and I'd planned it big because finally we have the space to show really big work. And, we locked down, and so did my brain. So I had to really think about how the effects of being shut away from everybody, what effect it was having on our culture. Because usually culture is transmitted in groups. It's transmitted by the time that you spend with others. And so there's several paintings. That first one was relationships, dance, drumming, family, all of those things being affected by this very, it wasn't just the pandemic, it was also what was going on in the United States with the terrible inequities of race that were happening there, with the death of
George Floyd.
Yeah. And the police response to it and the continued demonstrations. And here we sat so far away from it, but yet too, it affects us. And just the tremendous sadness that you felt. My mother, who is 91 years old, lives in a care home in Texas, and she caught COVID. And she had it for 5 or 6 weeks. And
Wow.
She also has dementia, so she didn't remember why she was feeling so bad. But just a lot of stress and strain, just at dealing with the total lack of control. Absolutely nothing you could do to, affect any change for anyone, but sit inside your house. And so I sat in my studio and made this work. So if we could see the next slide, or the next video. Okay, this was inspired by the traditional dance from Grenada, ballet, and which has its roots in Africa and France and Scotland, and just everything that's Caribbean that comes together is found in this dance.
Okay.
And so I made it by picking up scraps in my studio. The skirt is pieces of strips of canvas that I put down that are sort of throwaways, and I put down and I use it for a palette when I'm painting with acrylic paint.
Okay. I
And
can
so
see
you
that now
just
in the
see,
pattern. Absolutely.
yeah, this is just a, you know, a conglomeration of paint on the palette. And then the pieces of the collars, just pieces of white cloth that are stitched together. And we didn't really get close enough to see, but that red thread that binds all of us. And if you go back into our history and you look at the meaning of red in red clothing, and that red thread that is used in many rituals and ceremonies. So one of the ladies has a safety pin attached to the backside of her collar, because a safety pin is also a protection for women. So, you know, it just has lots of meaning woven into it. And I didn't know until I hung it up that the breeze was going to blow the skirts like that.
It's
So
quite remarkable. Yeah,
that was a really pleasant surprise.
I was going to ask you about that. And
Yeah.
I find it fascinating, even before we get into the details of the work, the challenge of creativity in moments like lockdown. And I've spoken to a lot of artists in the last few months. Some have been more prolific than ever. Mm-hmm. Some have had complete creative block. Mm-hmm. So I'm really pleased to see that even after that moment of feeling helpless,
yeah,
that you were then able to kind of channel that into this really sort of large site-specific work. I mean, it seems like there's 3 panels. Am I right?
6 altogether.
6 panels of that sort of scale.
Yeah.
So it's a really monumental series, exploring, as you said, with the dance, but also music, and those various cultural traditions in this one.
Family, relationships. Yeah.
And I think that, you know, the way that it evolved from the original concept for it to really address this idea of connectivity and tradition and the passing on of traditions. And in this case, the challenges around the loss of tradition when you can't come together as a family or as a community. I know in my island, a lot of culture is passed on one-to-one. It's through storytelling. Not much is written down.
Right.
Are shared, they're not archived at all yet.
Yeah.
So we really are at this moment of cultural crisis in many ways. And at the same time, you know, we've learned from creatives through CATAPULT and even this conversation just how we can also look at ways of adapting and helping find solutions to those challenges. So I think we have a couple of stills as well, don't we, to see the larger project. If we can bring those up on the screen.
Yeah, so you just see the 3 ladies there. And as the progression, as you read it from right to left, there is less and less of the woman's body being shown. So that the one on the, well, would be on the right. She has no head. You know, her arms fade away. And we lose pieces of ourselves.
And you really do get the sense of that movement and dance as well. We can't see the moving skirts in the wind there, but it's really remarkable how you've captured that. And I think as well, not seeing the whole body there, as you mentioned, also allows you to feel like you're sort of stepping in to the movement yourself and actually very much feeling part of it. And if we can move to the next image, I think we see the other part of the conversation, which is the music.
Okay, so this is the drumming. And drumming is still very much a part of culture in Grenada. And there's been one particular gentleman, Livingston Nelson, who has for decades kept it alive and researched. And, you know, I just have to tell a little story because it's so appropriate. Asher, my son, who is also my colleague, studied in Africa. He studied in Ghana at the University of Ghana. And he learned with a drum master. And he was down on the beach one evening just drumming with some of the guys in Accra. And they asked him, "Do you know what you're playing?" And he says, "No, this is just a rhythm from home in Grenada. I don't know what its meaning is, or, you know, its origin. It's just something I know." He says, "Everybody plays this." And it's true. It's a beat that you hear children playing on their desks at school. And what they told him is that song is from Ghana. And we all know how it came here. We know how it was passed along. And it is the welcome song for a king. And we had a king who was found on one of the ships just at the time that the British slave trade was ending. And the trade ended, and there was a group of people left on a ship, and one of them was the king. And he came and resided in Grenada. So the welcome song for the king is something that has lasted in our culture and in our consciousness without even knowing its origin. So here we have a group of drummers, and there's a child sitting on the edge and the side, but his hands are like below the drum. He's not drumming. His hands are like tied. And if we see the next still, we'll see him. We'll see him looking out at us, and he's questioning. He's staring directly at us, and around his head is a halo or a corona. And really, he's looking to us for answers. And what are we going to tell him? We can't tell him everything's going to be all right. We can't tell him we know the answers, because we don't. So again, the art opens the way for conversation.
And it does. And even just talking about the drum beat there, coming to Grenada through such trauma, and then it's sort of intrinsically becoming part of contemporary culture, so much so that you hear the music without really knowing the story. And I think that really does touch on not just the challenges around loss of traditions and the passing on traditions with the pandemic, but just how absolutely critical it is to unpack those stories and pass them on with true knowledge. So learning where the drum beat came from, passing that on to our children, and ensuring that they're aware of the full story and the full progression of those cultural transitions. Made more so and more relevant today when we're limited with the ways that we can do that. So it's a powerful work. And zooming in, I think, on this one child and that sense of uncertainty, as you said, looking for answers, and even entire communities were feeling this as adults, and we need to steward it going forward, so that the next generation, we mitigate the fallout from it as much as we possibly can. But I think it speaks to the pandemic, it speaks to the passing on of these traditions and our full histories, and not just the segmented histories that we have perhaps been taught in our own school systems as well, which fortunately are coming to the forefront now in the work that artists, museums, etc. are doing around the region.
And I have to say that a lot of this has been preserved through the passion of artists. Livingston Nelson is a drummer, but he's a passionate person about culture and drumming, and his desire and his life is geared toward this. And these passionate people are those who carry it forward.
How does it, I know we have challenges around, say, our traditional thatching in Cayman. So we're very, very briefly, we in the sort of 60s and 70s, when the financial sector started booming, everyone's heard of the Cayman Islands in relation to finance. But until that point, we were very maritime-based, very, very small society. In 1970, there were only 10,000 people in the Cayman Islands. And there's still only 70, so we're still very small comparatively. But the challenges that we have now is this massive globalization in a very small period, is even trying to get young people excited and involved in those traditions. So looking at ways of not only archiving and ensuring, and this is where the artists do play such a critical role, the passing on of tradition, but energizing and motivating young people to want to learn how to weave. Weaving doesn't necessarily scream as something that's super exciting to do if you're on Minecraft or you're on your iPhone. So looking at innovative ways to kind of rethink those traditions as well and keep them moving forward. is very much part of the practice that we
to
have.
make them cool and sexy again.
Yeah.
You know,
I use the word sexy a lot, actually, and people are like, what? I'm like, gotta be sexy. But it has been a very interesting journey for me as a curator. That's what one of my focuses is that this bridge between traditional craft and contemporary art, and how we make it interesting and sexy now more than ever.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Tell me a bit, it was great to learn about how you've sort of channeled your anxiety and stress into this really vibrant and monumental project. It really is very large. It definitely needs, I can see it exhibited in sort of this historic site or a very large contemporary space. But what about the gallery itself? What about the community? How and where are you guys right now in terms of moving out of lockdown? How are you coping as an institution as well as an artist?
Yeah, these are very, very hard times. You know, we have tiny amount of visitors. Just no help from our institutions. I did apply for a grant, you know, for my artists to be able to help them, and essentially was told, well, you don't qualify. So it has been very difficult. The gallery I've had online for a good number of years. But, you know, there's also this huge caution that people aren't really buying much of anything right now except essentials. You know, I hear that there's a huge upswing in the 1% of the 1% of art, people who use art to move their money around. But that isn't really filtering down to small galleries in the Caribbean. You know, we keep looking forward, we keep hoping. I mean, we cut our expenses as much as we can. We don't do all of the things that we would usually do. We keep hoping for a change. We keep hoping, you know, we're constantly looking forward to say, well, maybe when we can have some income again from this or that. But it has just been difficult.
And have you been, you mentioned the online component, because of course that's how a lot of museums, like my own as well, have pivoted to try and get a lot of our visual archives. We house the National Art Collection for the Cayman Islands. We've got that online. I've been learning a lot, like even doing these live sessions has been an interesting learning curve, because I was a bit of a tech dinosaur before this moment. But even, you know, the simpler tools we've found. I also work as the president of the Caribbean. So we've been talking a lot about digital access and also the challenges around digital access. You know, a lot of families that don't have multiple tablets or laptops for learning or working, or very, very, you know, big challenges around bandwidth and even connecting to the internet. So looking at different ways, whether it's a website, and you guys have a really great website. It was really good to learn about what you're doing through that site. But also Instagram, social media. I think you've said that you yourself have been uptaking in sharing your work and the work of your artists in Instagram.
Yeah, have used Instagram excessively. It's also kind of a rabbit hole you run down, and you can use up a lot of time, you know, and managing your time when there's nothing to do is really essential, because you can, you know, go down lots of rabbit holes, and at the end of the day, you really haven't accomplished anything. So challenges of our times.
I think that's a great question as well, because, you know, you can go on Instagram and tell yourself that you're doing visual research, and then, which is great, and I have learned a lot as well. But as you said, sort of monitoring that, because I spoke to someone a couple of days ago about Zoom meetings, because they're back in lockdown. We're relatively free in Cayman because the borders have been closed for a long time. But, you know, even Zoom is such an amazing tool in one way. But after 5 or 6 Zoom meetings, you're so drained.
You don't want to do it anymore.
And balancing that with your own creativity, because, you know, that it's not very conducive, the management of the gallery with your own practice. And I was really interested to talk to you about that as well. You obviously have created a good structure for yourself to be able to put the sort of business hat on and manage other people's creativity, which is what I'm doing, and then also create the work. I have big respect for that, because it's two different sides of the brain, and they're at war with each other sometimes. So you've obviously found a good middle ground.
Well, I have a team of people who help me.
Good. We all need good teams ultimately, and I think we found that in this moment more than ever. You know, working, collaborating, expanding those teams. I think that's been one of the really important takeaways for me, not just with my own staff, but with artists, colleagues, new colleagues like yourself from around the region. It's really making it bearable. But the sort of what next as well. So we're in this moment. We are coming through lockdown, and I do want to just remind everyone we're going to be moving into Q&A relatively soon. So if you do have questions, please put them in the comment box. You can add those at any point. You know, it's really too soon to make sense in some ways and kind of understand what 2021 is going to look like. I've been hearing on the news about, you know, vaccines suddenly coming to the forefront, but there's a lot of questions around those, and also when we as small island nations will be receiving those. You know, most of us rely on tourism, so having those borders opened is so critical to getting back up and running in terms of galleries and art sales, music, events and concerts, etc. So what are you thinking is going to be happening in the next maybe 6 months to a year for your space?
I just don't know. I'm afraid to plan anything. That's the truth. You know, I'm afraid. I don't want to start, you know, with my whole regular yearly schedule and say, oh, that one's canceled, that one's canceled, that one's canceled. So right now I'm just trying to be fluid and flexible. We're looking at some overseas possibilities. We can, you know, we still have shipping. We can ship work out, even if we, as people, don't want to or can't go. You know, so work can be seen. You know, video work. We have some of our artists applying for a video exhibition in Cuba. You know, we just have to look at what is available and try to use it. For my own space, it's just, you know, I just don't know.
Well, but I think that's a really great approach, because you've already had experience in history. I know you guys have been at the Venice Biennale, I think 3 times now. Which is, you know, a remarkable achievement in its own right. And we need a whole other session to really unpack the complications of getting there, applying, and I do want to learn more about that from you. But already having that sort of international kind of viewpoint, which we all hope to seek, but sometimes struggle with in our spaces.
The mechanism, the mechanism of how to get there.
And in some of the institutions, that the national agenda versus the international agenda. But really, if we want to provide opportunities for our artists across the region, we have to be seeking those international platforms.
Absolutely.
In many ways, though, this moment and the digitization of the moment should be offering some exciting new opportunities. So I'm pleased to hear that some of your artists are already taking advantage of that.
Yeah, they really are. Yeah.
And have you found that your own audience through the Instagram posts, through the website in the moment, has helped kind of expand those audiences as well? Have you seen
I would like to think so. Yeah.
So one of the positives potentially.
Potentially.
We have to find those positives, don't we? So we have to keep looking for them. Well, I'm excited to see what next. Now, I think one of the great opportunities that Catapult has sort of brought to the forefront is these opportunities for certainly digital collaboration to start with. You know, learning about the artists that are doing the virtual residencies is a fantastic project as well, and something that would be great for artists around the world to continue exchanging that way. But I know we have some questions on the comments. I have a couple more, but I don't want to miss some of these as well. So I'm going to kind of read these. Some of just very big hellos as well. Great to see Rosie in the audience there. So
hi, Rosie.
Rosie. Yeah, so we've got Susan Bahol saying, incredible work, Susan. Greetings from Susan Wilczak from Benton Harbor. And so, yeah, they're just really, really great comments. So I have a couple more questions while we wait and see if anyone does have a question. You know, I think what the moment brings, and I think something we've already started discussing, is just how cool advocacy, understanding of what the visual arts are, or the arts in the wider sense. And I know this is something we all struggle with across the region. And I've had so many conversations with people like Annalie Davis from Fresh Milk, whether that's underneath the Tilting Axis gatherings that we've had for the last few years, or through one-on-one projects with the Museums Association. In lockdown, it was a really interesting moment. I applied for an essential worker permit when we went into lockdown to say, our museum is responsible for the National Art Collection. I have to go in several times a week just to check that the art's okay. Denied.
Yeah.
But again, went to appeal, denied. You're not essential. It's locked up. It's fine. And we were doing a lot of work on our digital platform. So from an audience engagement, that was fine. But we had to go to a second appeal, really kind of explain why being the custodian of this National Art Collection is rather essential. So it's really opened up to me this idea of maybe trying to come together as art spaces to look at some way of maybe a more unified way of advocating to the decision makers, whether that's through an association, whether that's just a more of an organic coming together, whether that is something that would be useful in Grenada as well, or what's happening in Grenada in terms of advocacy and visibility.
And in terms of archives generally, I don't even, it is so sadly misunderstood and lacking in taking care of our vital records even. So that's a bigger conversation than we can have here. But absolutely any of those paths through organized, and CARICOM should be a body that could be appealed to, the small, connections, groupings, anywhere where we can talk about it is going to be a positive thing for preserving the Caribbean art that we do have. Global climate change. We've been just wiped out by hurricanes.
Absolutely.
And we need to, plan for our future. We don't need to just let the future keep happening to us.
And even the challenges of that disaster management training when you're on lockdown, it's one thing to do that virtually. But even with my MAC work, we've had to put a couple of big training sessions in the French Caribbean on hold. But we're still in the middle of the hurricane season, and that doesn't stop because of COVID, does it? It just complicates things even further. We do have a couple of questions that have popped up. Susan, can you tell us more about your relationships with galleries and artists around the region? Do you have any observations about cross-cultural intra-Caribbean exchanges through your work? And I know you've done some of this. So tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, so I have galleries in Barbados who represent me, and Barbados has just been very, very good to me. Barbados has carried me when there's nothing else going on. So big shout out to art collectors from Barbados. I have said this to all the powers that be every time I can. The biggest challenge to art developing across the region is our governmental customs and duties and VAT and permissions. And it is so difficult and expensive to send a piece of artwork to another Caribbean destination. It's just ridiculous. Especially after you visit Europe and you see how easy it is to travel from one country in Europe to another. And because it's a union, it's the, European Union. And we have in CARICOM a grouping of islands that are supposed to be financially unified, but we're not. And until this is sorted, all the talk is just going to be talk, because every little walking ground god in a customs office is going to want to stop that package and charge you a big set of money to let it pass.
Yeah.
So there has to be, from the top go down, there has to be a mandate. If art, performers have the same issues. Maybe spoken word poets aren't as suffering because people don't know what they do. They're not really sure. But this is just the monumental hurdle. And so, can't say more about that until we sort that out. And again, we have to get our leaders on board.
Exactly. I was going to say this is really another very important topic for that sort of advocacy conversation, universal sense. And it's one thing to advocate to your own government, but unless you're making those changes on a regional platform, it doesn't change. Cayman, for example, it's a flat 22% to import art. It's the same percentage as a couch, a car, a piece of fruit. It's just the flat 22%. And that's even, as you say, getting it moving through customs and not getting it stuck for a month in not a temperature controlled environment, and being concerned about those aspects as well. Another quick question, because again, that's almost a great panel discussion in its own right, and I hope we can reconnect on that. Susan, this is from Annalie. A big shout out to Annalie again for all the great work here. You mentioned that the Grenada Revolution is something that had been not spoken about enough in the Anglophone Caribbean. You can see this now in the screenshot. The revolution being articulated by the art community.
This is a really good question. A number of years ago, the Grenada Arts Council did an invitational and had about 30, 40 pieces of art that was done around the revolution theme. We have artists who use it specifically to speak in areas of justice. That's on YouTube. You can find it, I think, under either Grenada Arts Council or under one of my channels on YouTube. There have been books, a lot of books that have been written. You know, now it's all these years later, and people are just now starting to tell their stories, and a lot of that is coming through in art. The new book that is just out by Laurie Lambert about women's influence in the revolution. So yeah, there's a lot more material coming. I think maybe the reason it wasn't talked about so much, particularly from Grenada, is that people were so hurt that they just couldn't bear to revisit that hurt. And there's been other work done on monuments, what the monuments of the revolution have been. So yeah, there's a lot of written work. There's some literature. There's some visual art. But again, I think our platform needs to be bigger so people can see it.
Well, it's great to know that that's really starting to take the forefront, and people are beginning to address and unpack those histories. And there was a really great, not in relation to Grenada, but in terms of discussions around the current moment and monuments, and revisiting those monuments. Obviously, there's so much going on across the region. Shani Roper at the UE Museum in Jamaica did a really great series. Anyone out there, I would definitely recommend you connect to Shani's work, which is online, around this discussion. And Tara Innes, Barbados, are doing some great dialogue around this as well. And we have some good colleagues in Martinique. Matt hosted a conference there last year, our first bilingual one for many years, and again, doing some great work in that area. So I'm going to look out for those publications, Susan. I don't know a lot, I'll be honest, about the history of Grenada. I'm very interested in learning more.
The revolution is one of those stories that has one truth and then another side of the story, then another side of the story and another, and the truth lies somewhere in the intangible. There is not just one story.
Which loops back beautifully to the beginning of our conversation and the way that your work tries to capture those nuances from multiple viewpoints. And of course, we're all living in a moment, a global moment, where those facts and those realities are multi-layered and have multiple angles as well. I'm going to go to one more question quickly here before we wrap up and say our thank yous. This is from Catherine Kennedy, also doing amazing work with Fresh Milk and this Catapult platform. So big shout out to Catherine and Annalie. Susan, many cultural practitioners have to juggle multiple roles, which is something that you have navigated for many, many years now. How do you balance the different kinds of work? And we touched briefly on that creative brain and the administrative brain. Obviously, the team or the people that work with you do help you regulate that. But this is from someone, Catherine, who I know is a artistic practitioner and an administrator. So give us some advice.
I have to say, you know, I didn't go to art school. My first undergraduate work was in science. As I know, Rosie Gordon-Wallace, her first area was science as well. And the study of science teaches you a lot about how to use your left brain. So I would say that everything that I learned all along the way have contributed to the ability to juggle all of these things. And, you know, you just have to cut out time for focus on the task at hand at this moment, and then you move to your creative practice, then you move to something else. It's just life.
And you know, we mentioned briefly that that's becoming, in a way, was becoming more challenging in lockdown, because I think what this moment is also teaching us is, you know, maybe we want to shift the way that we've done things historically. Certainly, you know, I work is my life, takes up everything. It's 24/7. I love what I do, but I realized I gave myself very little downtime from that.
Yeah.
Because if you love creativity and you also work in the arts, there's not a lot of room outside of that for something, you know, completely different.
One thing I had said to you before, and I think it's important to reiterate, is that we in the Caribbean, we don't have institutions that tell us how to do things. We don't have prescribed ways of going. So often we're like breaking bush to make a path for ourselves. And I think in this new time and a new way of doing things, maybe we're particularly skilled and gifted to somehow maneuver in this new era.
I think that's a fantastic observation. You're absolutely right. We've had to adapt for centuries. We've had to adapt individually. If we are, like I am, in an institution, but it's a very untraditional institution. And that has made us nimble and able to sort of continue to out of need.
And to shift when we need to.
To shift, absolutely. So looking at this moment, maybe we come to it with more tools than a lot of our colleagues around the world. And I think that this platform alone is a great example of that.
It is.
You know, how do you get past this idea of being isolated and bringing people together? And it's a really natural development of many years of talking about the limitations of connectivity in the Caribbean due to many of the things you pointed out: customs, shipping routes. If I want to ship anything out of Cayman, it goes to Miami and then comes back down to Grenada or Barbados or even Jamaica, who's only 80 miles from our little island. It's crazy. And I think I would love to continue with all of the people that are out there today: Annalie, Rosie, Susan. We need to continue committing to this conversation about how we can together shift that and make this change.
We're really good pirates is what we are.
Cayman has a long history of, putting that forefront out. So we can certainly learn from those forefathers, even if we maybe want to repackage it for the 21st century in many, many ways. I think we're getting very close to time. Susan, I'd love to invite you to sort of sum up not only being part of Catapult, but your practice, the moment that we're finding ourselves in, a couple of words of wisdom, even if we're not quite sure what that future is going to look like. So over to you.
I would just like to say, we didn't talk much about the Biennale, but what I would like to say to any of the artists or curators who are watching is, it's possible. I went as a just complete innocent, but I found people along the way who are willing to help me. And I am very willing. Anybody who has questions or want to know where to start on the map, I am very willing to point the direction. I would say that sometimes we in the Caribbean, we think a little bit too much of ourselves, and we think of ourselves as being so advanced and independent. The bottom line is we need each other. We need other artists, other organizations to help us, to show us the way. And I have found some of those organizations. And, I am willing to share what I've learned with anybody who wants to make the effort. I've had a couple of artists say to me over the years about organizing. Why should I get my hands dirty for someone else? And the answer is, when you get your hands dirty for someone else, you lift yourself up so much. It's really worth the effort for if you have the ability to do the work and not wait. It's never going to come to you. Nobody's going to come and put it in your lap. You have to be the one willing to do the hard work of making it happen. So yeah, so I just would like to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with Natalie and with all of you, and to thank Fresh Milk especially for this fantastic opportunity, and the American Friends of Jamaica and Kingston Creative. This just couldn't have been better. So really a whole lot of appreciation for what you're doing.
Well, and Susan, I want to reiterate this idea of giving, because if we can take anything away from this moment, whether that's giving or sharing food with our neighbors or with our communities, really in the heart of lockdown, and what that's meant in terms of opening doors and reaching out, I think we are pushing that back to the forefront. And I think this is a moment that we can take that forward in a much more visible way than we have maybe for the last. You know, we've all come through systems in the region at times when people hold on to their knowledge and really don't want to open those doors. Rightly so, in some cases, for fear of losing jobs or not having maybe the one cultural job that's available, or losing it because they're passing on knowledge. But of course we can't function that way, and it's a very lonely path if we're going to function that way. We briefly touched on in our last meeting together about succession planning and the next generation of cultural leaders. You know, they're in absolutely critical to the work that you're doing now to be able to pass that on. So if we can take anything away from this moment, it really is the sharing of knowledge, the collaborative models, the coming together, putting our energy behind making some of those differences at a leadership and advocacy level as well, something we should definitely reconnect on. And I'll talk about Venice, because I would love your inputs, even though my country is not a country and doesn't technically qualify. I still have an issue with that, but we'll get around it too. But this has been
money.
Well, that's the next big question. So I might have to push it back a couple of years while that stays local, and then we'll build out again, maybe together. But I want to say a very, very big thank you to. We had a couple more questions from Rosie. We didn't get to those. The concept of post-Blackness in Grenada. We'll continue talking offline with Rosie on that. Again, Rosie says, biennial, huge success. Thank you for your leadership, Susan. And really wonderful outpouring of support in our comments section there. But again, a huge thank you from me and Susan, to follow Susan's thanks, to the Catapult team, Kingston Creative, American Friends of Jamaica, and Fresh Milk, Annalie and Catherine are online with us today. So big shout out to them as individuals too. Do tune in again this afternoon. I'm going to be speaking with Nicholas Rose, a contemporary artist from Jamaica. Very excited to have some dialogue with Nicholas this afternoon. And just a very, very big thank you to you, our audience, as well, for tuning in to another session of the virtual salon in lockdown by the Catapult team. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Now. Bye.
Bye.